Hi, John here, and today's guest on Winning Teams podcast is Devin Halliday, who is the founder of Rudiment Solutions and also has his own podcast, Behaving Factor. Now, Devin is a really, really interesting guy, and I think that this podcast is for people who really want to understand how to develop the culture in your organization and also how you get that connection between culture and great results. Things that we're talking about during this episode is, having a really clear definition of what the culture means. When we talk about our culture is filled with whatever the component parts are, what actually do they mean in the organization on a day-to-day basis? Also, kind of trying to get under the skin of the research that says that, well, everyone says that culture is terribly important, but only 41% people say they don't have the time to spend any time on it. So why, if it's important, but 41% say they've no time, how do you actually get that right? And how do you actually get people to feel that, yes, it is important, and yes, I am going to spend time doing that? And also how we really kind of bridge that understanding between the importance of culture and the results that we're getting here today. So I think that this podcast is really interesting for people who are struggling with culture and want to find how they can bring it to the next level. So you can join me and Devin in this conversation. But if you want, there's loads of other resources. Go to my website, www.johnmurphyinternational.com, where you'll find a bundle of resources that will really, really help you to improve your leadership and help you build winning teams. Talk real soon. So now let's go over and listen to Devin. Today's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Devin Halliday, who hails all the way from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Devin is an interesting guy. He's the host of the Belonging Factor podcast. He's the founder, and I love this, the chief belonging architect at Rudiment Solutions, and he has also served in the U.S. Navy. He's the author of The Belonging Factor, which has a title of How Great Brands and Great Leaders Inspire Loyalty, Build Community, and Grow Profits, which is a big statement. Devin, you're very welcome here today.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate being here. This is great.
Now, listen, I'm looking forward to it. Maybe just give a little bit of background about your journey from being in the Navy to where you are now and why you do what you do, just so people have a bit of context.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, John. So here's the short version of it. I spent my growing up years thinking that the place that I belonged in my life was in the military in aviation, because my grandfather used to take me out to see the Blue Angels, which is the Navy's flight demonstration squadron, so the fighter jets doing all their great maneuvers. And then the movie Top Gun came out, right? And for me as a child, I was like, yes, that's my spot right there. That's where I belong. And so I manifested that and ended up being stationed on two different aircraft carriers, forward deployed, based in Japan, and doing some amazing work with amazing men and women on helping make sure that aircraft stayed in the air. I was an aircraft mechanic. So I got to work with the pilots, the crews, and these aircraft, which was phenomenal. But one thing that I didn't really fully get in my young wisdom, we'll call it, was this is still the military. So it's still a very prescriptive, hierarchical environment. Individuality is not encouraged. And so as I really started now forming my identity in my young adult years, I really started to find that oh my gosh, this wasn't the place that I belong. This isn't really my tribe. And so I started to think about what post-Navy would look like. Initially, when I went in with the idea that I'm going to be a career guy and I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. What I realized was I have a different calling, and I wasn't exactly certain what it was, but I knew that it extended beyond the military. So then I found myself working in a Fortune 15 organization here in the United States, Verizon Wireless, really big company. And I had the opportunity over several years to continue to promote and advance in my career and really started to find my passion, which was helping people unlock that thing for them that changes their perspective or shifts their paradigm on how they can achieve success or how they can achieve things that they maybe didn't think were possible, which has informed now over many, many years of building and leading winning teams, of studying and winning, or studying and reviewing and working with winning leaders. I really defined what my personal mission was, and that's to unlock and develop the potential in others so that they can do more, whatever that looks like. And in the
And how
context of
do
a
you,
work situation, go
sorry,
ahead.
Devin. And how long were you in the army? I mean, how long did it take you to realize that, this ain't for me?
Oh, well, so let's see. I probably realized it at about 12 months in, and I had a 4-year enlistment. So
All right.
it was a process of going through that time of contributing and doing the work that I loved and working with the people that were amazing, but also realizing that I needed to start planning what might come next without understanding exactly what that looked like. So
And
again,
when did you actually start to found the Rudiment Solutions? When did that come about?
so I spent 18 years in the corporate world, and now Rudiment Solutions, my consulting business, was founded in 2018. So it's a year-old organization, and it took me really all of that time learning and shaping what made the most sense for me and what my calling was, and the mission I just shared with you, and how to apply that now in a bigger scale outside of a single organization, but across many organizations that have a need, a want, and a desire to build teams that win, not because of how you focus on just process and just profit, but how you interject people and purpose into that.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I love the message that you say on your website and elsewhere. But I mentioned the book, the belonging factor, how great brands and great leaders inspire loyalty, build community, and grow profits. And and I think that all of those things that you said about the brands, about the leadership, about building the community and the profits, they all do have to go together. But one of the things that I was smiled at when you say in the book that you say that the vast majority of culture and value statements are pure bullshit, which I would tend to agree, because I always think when I go into an office and I see it up on the wall in reception, I have a slight nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach that, I wonder, is this actually being lived to? But you obviously share that view.
Oh, yeah, I do share that view, and that comes from a wealth of my own experience personally, as well as the experience in working with some of the amazing teams and organizations that I have the opportunity to work with that ultimately want to do the right thing, and they are just bogged down in some details or some kind of check the box mentality in some cases. And so, yeah, they are sometimes bullshit. In fact, here's when they are. They are when they live on a wall or on a computer screen or at an annual meeting, and then that's the end of it. And so, like the I chuckle a little because it is a little comical when you see it as a repetition over and over and over, because you realize it's not the fault of a specific individual leader or leadership group. It is a fault of how we have set up or understood what our priority is around building a culture that supports the people around an aligned purpose to then do these other things that we tend to spend most of our time on in any organization, which is figure out our processes and our systems to deliver a consistent and reliable result. And the biggest variable there, in fact, the most controllable variable, is the people that we bring into the organization, the people we retain in an organization, and of course, what that culture looks like to attract the best and keep the best, right? And so when I talk to folks who have a huge challenge with whether it's turnover or whether it's missing year-over-year goals or budgets, oftentimes I'm asked to let's focus on fixing the output. But the reality is, to fix the output, you have to get into the team and into the people and into the leaders and into the values of your organization first to figure out where they live and if they live
Absolutely, yeah.
and how to
And
address it
but
if they don't.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, one of the things that always fascinates me when I go in and, I mean, I work in lots of organizations and people say, oh, we don't have the right culture, or we don't have the right values, or, we have statements, but we don't live them. And the question that I always kind of really bothers me is, Why is it that people actually tolerate that? Why do they put up with the fact that, they have these statements on the wall, but actually they're not lived up to, and they somehow feel powerless to do something about it? Is that something that you come across and that you have found an answer to?
Yeah, it is. And I'd be curious actually to hear from you. So when you say people feel powerless to help it, what level of organization do you experience that with? Is that with senior leaders? Is that with pretty much universal across the org,
It's
or is that
it's
with
pretty much
mid-level
across the
management?
organization. It almost seems as if the values and the culture is something separate to them, and they don't have a say in it. And I mean, you hear
Yeah.
it, for example, I mean, taking a very kind of specific example, you hear people saying, oh, there's a culture of meeting after meeting in this organization. And I always say, well, why don't you say I'm not going? I mean, why not? Why can't you say I'm not going to that meeting? Why are you just kind of following along to it? And it always fascinates me why people feel powerless to actually challenge or adjust it.
Yeah, and so that speaks to so many things, John. Just that one specific example, right? So many things that are simple to address, although they require effort and work. They're not easy. And some of the first parts of why maybe somebody doesn't feel comfortable, at least from my experience and perspective, is that there is not an alignment along those values. Number one. Number two, there's not a clear definition of whatever the organization's values are that show up in expected behaviors for those values. So, for example, if a value is that let's talk about being a value of highly efficient operators, right? Like that might be a value, is to be lean and efficient in our time. So if we are establishing that value, what are the behaviors that show up that you should expect as an organization from a senior leader, a mid-level leader, an individual contributor, and maybe different by organizational role, whether maybe you're a finance person, a salesperson, an IT, or maybe just kind of depending on your organizational role. You should have a very clear definition of an organization of what those look like. Because let's be clear, there is a very clear definition across what success looks like in every other measurable key performance indicator. But there's not this definition of what success looks like in living the values in many, many cases. And that's probably one of the first places is so that creates a bit of a gap in trust. Will my boss listen to or respect me when I say, hey, listen, I'm not going to the meeting after the meeting? So what happens is when you don't have that definition, John, you have unintentional culture that is created. I'm sure nobody, when they created their culture statement for their organization, said, hey, we're going to also have part of our culture meetings after meetings. Nobody said that, right? Of course. But it shows up because there's not that clear definition or understanding what those roles, behaviors look like within each value set that you have for your organizational culture.
I mean, I think it's also interesting, and you make the point in the book, was that we say that everybody will say, yes, culture is important. I mean, you're not going to ask, nobody that you would ask an organization say, is culture not important? They're not going to say, oh, no, I couldn't care less. So everybody says that culture is important. But 41% of leaders say they're too busy. So there's a contradiction in terms. Why does that happen?
My experience is that it's sometimes difficult to see the forest through the trees. So let me run this down real briefly. What I mean by that. So culture is a word that sometimes is obfuscated or has different definitions for different people within an organization when there is a lack of the clarity of what that culture means to the bottom line. So in the book, I talk about being a catalyst for profits, being a catalyst for great community, collaboration, teamwork, innovation. So when you have these 41% of managers surveyed by E&Y who said, I just don't have time for this, my experience is I don't have time for things that take away from delivering on my KPIs or the deliverables that I'm expected to for whatever project or quarter that we're in. And it's because of the focus on the outcome or the output rather than the focus on those inputting to deliver that outcome. And it has to be a marriage between the two. But if I can, just for everybody who's listening, give some context to what I mean when I say a catalyst of profits. This matters so much. Building a strong culture of whether it's a diversified team that brings so many cognitive diverse strengths to the organization, or it's creating a culture of collaboration and trust. Here's where the rubber meets the road. Same survey. You have 50% higher productivity. You have 6 points higher gross margin and 10 points higher revenue growth. You have 57% better collaboration. And you have 3.5 times more employees showing up at their full potential to work, which leads to 43% more likely to be above average in your profits in your sector, right? In whatever your industry is. That's where the rubber meets the road. These are all organizations that have established cultures of collaboration, trust, belonging, diversity, and inclusion that deliver these results I just talked about. But then that's just the part of it that talks about the end result for the org. What about the end result for your people? Again, same survey, 106% reported they have more energy and 76% reported they're more engaged. And then also think about the opposite side on that, more energy, more engagement. That also correlated to 74% less stress and 40% less burnout. So you have people who are doing the same work, actually doing more work, contributing more, showing up more fully with their ideas, their potential, and they feel better and they're less stressed. So it's like you solve this kind of holistic thing when you start building out a culture intentionally that is going to deliver the output you're looking for, rather than just focusing on the output and then feeling like people are indispensable cogs that can just move in and out of their positions.
Is that not then the fault? Is that not then the fault of leadership, that we're not making the connection between culture and performance and results? Because they're not separate. And when you're looking at an organization, I mean, the reason you create any organization, okay, it is to have a profit, but it's got a purpose and it's got a mission. But if you don't have a profitable organization, you don't have an organization. But the culture of that organization, for all the statistics that you mentioned there, they're all contributing to the growth and the profitability, the health and the well-being of that organization. So for the people to say 41% say they're too busy to do it, they're just missing the connection between culture and results, aren't they?
Yeah, that's correct. And so, to your initial question, is that the fault of like leadership, I believe was your question. That's part of it. It requires such a deliberate effort. In fact, in the book, I talk about a company called Populous Group, and they're based in Portland, Oregon in the U.S. And the CEO and co-founder, Bobby Herrera, he was very clear about the intention from the get-go to build a culture around delivering high-performing results. And that was his initial idea. What does a culture of high performance look like? And over many years of many attempts at getting it exactly right, he feels at this point they've got the exact formula, which it's about creating high performing people and teams that perform at their highest capability, rather than thinking about what are all of the, not rather than, but in addition to thinking about what are the markets strategically we need to be into, or what are the markets strategically we should exit, and all of those other plans that are incredibly vital and incredibly important to the success and growth of a business. It's an and, not an or. And so when you kind of rewind back to the 41% of managers who say, I'm too busy to do this, it's led by the fact that every single weekly call, monthly meeting, or quarterly readout that these managers and leaders need to do is focused on solely and exclusively the output. So it's a very time-tested method that we've used in business, where we're constantly focused on the output because that's what our stakeholders and shareholders ask of us. But there's nothing about what does the culture of your team look like? And there are certainly things like what is the diversity of your team like, but what does the culture of your team look like? So is it driven from the top? It is. Is it always intentional? No. And so that's the argument that I make, is that it must be intentional, it must be driven from the top, it must be clearly defined, because values truly show up at the intersection of the ideas we have and the behaviors that we demonstrate. And so
absolutely. And I mean, so you mentioned the word there, talked about diversity, and you talk about it in the book. And one of the things that I find that is a challenge to organization is where, we talk about diversity and inclusion and you make it real as opposed to tokenism. And you do see examples of tokenism. How do you make, the whole, thought process and concept of diversity and inclusion, how do you make it real in the organization?
Yeah, so this is where we start to look at kind of the meat of the belonging factor, right? For me, anyway, kind of looking at these elements. And so when I talk about building diversity, and creating an inclusive environment, a big part of that is that cognitive or intellectual diversity. And so we start measuring what matters, which is the different backgrounds or makeup we have of our team, meaning not just the things maybe you could see, whether or not somebody is disabled or their gender or their racial background, but also education or lived experience that people have that they can bring to the team that are going to elevate the team. A lot of businesses hire a culture fit, and I encourage hiring a culture add, a person who's coming in and adding something to that team. So when we look at, to your question about not being tokenistic in diversity and really truly focusing on the idea of inclusion and that sense of belonging, some of the most important things are eliminating the echo chamber effect. And so what I mean by that, it's kind of the groupthink mentality. If you're a leader and you see that and hear the same types of dialogue, the same types of conversations are happening amongst everybody, that can be a good thing, but it needs to be a moment for a leader to look at it and say, are we stuck in this same kind of thought loop and thought wheel? And who are the people on my team that are maybe not contributing, or that we haven't asked what their idea is, or I haven't created a system where constructive dissent can be encouraged, meaning somebody who just kind of goes against the grain has a different idea. Oftentimes that's looked on unfavorably versus looking at favorably to understand why a person is bringing forth some of these ideas. And so that's where inclusion comes in, to create that environment where people can do that, where we don't have this idea or existence in the culture of just constantly moving in the echo chamber, the groupthink. So we have to start seeking to understand others and teaching our folks on our teams to understand that the background or diversity or ideas, no matter how crazy, that come forth from anybody on the team, it's just as important to give the voice to that as it is to actually honestly consider it. And when you have the first one missing, meaning there's no room for a voice, then you're never going to get the second piece, which is people feeling like they can share and will share those things that they see as meaningful to delivering the output. Very rarely do I see people who are intentionally trying to derail something. Most of the time, they just don't have a very tactful way of entering into why they think we could go a different direction or a team could make a different decision. So if the organization isn't set up in a way to encourage that, those people become silent. Yeah. And that's where the diversity and the inclusion goes away.
Absolutely. And that's really what, I mean, it comes back to the culture, doesn't it? I mean, that's the at the core of that is your culture. We could go on talking, but there was one thing I wanted to ask you about, because I know you talk about authenticity in the book. And I know authenticity is a word that, it does get bandied around quite a bit. And I'm just interested in what you mean by that, and how do people get it and how do they keep it?
Perfect. So yeah, you're right. Authenticity, it's a word that gets used in many different contexts or without the actual meaning of authenticity. Kind of like when, at least in the US, the word literally has become synonymous with more figuratively. People say, oh, I was literally on fire. Well, no, you weren't, right? And so authenticity has kind of taken on a little bit of that. I get it. You were hot. I understand it was hot, but you weren't literally on fire. So here's the get it and keep it. The concept is this: model what's expected, be who you say you are. And this is for an organization and for the individual leaders or people within it, right? And so it requires two very critical pieces. And number one is the ability to self-analyze. So this is a massively important skill for any leader and for any person who is going to achieve any level of success, is the ability to self-analyze. And that starts with deliberately taking the steps to evaluate what is it that you say your values are individually, personally. Do they align? And where they do, what are those actions or behaviors that you're doing to support that? And where they don't, what are the actions or behaviors you should be doing to support that? And then second, I talk about knowing your pluses and your deltas, and this is kind of a 360 feedback model almost, where you are constantly curious to learn from and seek feedback from others, because ultimately they're the judge every day about whether or not they perceive you to be an authentic person. And so seeking feedback, and this is something that requires some vulnerability. It requires a lot of transparency to be able to establish from the get-go that you are a partner with the teams you're leading. And as a leader, you don't have to feel that pressure of always having to be right, of always having to be on. Instead, you can you can release some of that pressure, because I know it weighs, particularly on senior leaders, to really act and behave in this certain role. But the best way to do that is to take a strong stance of being transparent and vulnerable and seeking feedback from your team. And then you marry those two pieces of feedback together, the stuff from your team and your self-analysis, and that gives you the tools to really, truly identify where you're doing well and where you can improve. And this is not something that anybody else in your organization is going to do for you. And it's usually not something an organization is going to prescribe, although there are certain surveys and other things that companies do. More importantly, as a leader who's going to excel in authenticity, it starts with what you do in those areas. And if you keep those two practices going, self-analyzation, 360 feedback, you're going to be able to continue to be who you say you are and be that authentic person.
I think your point is very well made, and I think also it's one of the things that, I might believe I'm authentic, but actually it doesn't really matter. If nobody else thinks I'm authentic, then I'm not. And so it's actually more what everybody else thinks about me that is the critical piece, and that's the same. Because it's a bit like, a leader. You can only be a leader if you've got followers. It doesn't come with the title. And you only have followers if people, believe that you have got something, there's something about you that makes you worth following. And I think authenticity is so important in what you talk about 360 feedback. And it's so important for people to get that, because very often we're not as self-aware as we should be. And while we might think we're being authentic, perhaps we're not perceived as being authentic. And it's the perception that's actually the most important part.
Well, yeah, it is. I would add to that being true to yourself is so important. And so to know that you're being authentic to yourself, that could just mean that, so let's say you're fully aligned on that. You know that you're being authentic to yourself, but your team is telling you that you have these other opportunities. So it's about understanding where their understanding or their perception is at, meaning, do you have to be a little bit more transparent, a little bit more vulnerable, let them have a few more pieces of you to identify and understand where you're being authentic? Or is it that truly what you think is right is not what everybody else thinks is right, and you have to identify if that's a place where you need to add a value or adjust a value of your own, potentially. So it definitely requires that marriage of those two things, no doubt about it. Because if we just go down the idea of perception and we're constantly trying to be what somebody else expects of us, man, that's exhausting.
It is, yeah.
Particularly if it doesn't align with who we know to be in ourselves.
Yeah, there's no doubt it has to start with ourselves, but I think the 360 feedback helps us to match who we are with how we're perceived, and I think that is true. I love what you said about being strongly vulnerable, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's absolutely not. And I know that you were very intentional about the way you said that, and I loved the way you said that, because I think you have to be strong in order to demonstrate vulnerability. It's not a weakness. You have to be strong in order to demonstrate vulnerability. Devin, I could go on because this has been really, really fantastic, but I'm very conscious that our time is coming to an end. Before I ask you how people can get in touch with you, etc., I would like to ask you a question that I ask everybody: is a book other than your own that has made a significant impact upon you?
I read Chicken Soup for the Soul, Jack Canfield, very, very early on in my journey into management, before I could tell you I was really qualified to say I was a leader of people. And there was one particular thing that came out in that book that changed my life at that point, and in something that I've used to instill in others many, many times since. And that is an equation. It's E plus R equals O. And, Covey has his own version of this as well in 7 Habits. But it's that idea of, it doesn't matter what the event is or the situation is. It's your response, your R, that equals the outcome. You have to have the two together. And for me, that was a giant paradigm shift around self-accountability and always looking to find a solution to deliver the outcome, or as close to the outcome that you wanted as you can get, no matter what happens. We all get curveballs. We all get fire drills thrown at us. How do you respond to that to dictate the outcome you want? That was so powerful for me. There's many things about that book, but that one is for sure.
Yeah, gosh, it's a long time since I picked that book up, but you just reminded me to go back and have a look at it again, because yes, it was quite seminal and very, very powerful. Second question: daily rituals. Do you have them? What do they do for you, and what are they?
So I do have some daily rituals. The first one is a really important one for me in my emotional and mental health, and that is every morning it's a early wake up, and my wife and I always make time to sit outside if the weather's nice and have a cup of coffee and really just kind of connect very clearly with each other to start the day on not just the tasks and minutia of the day, but how we're feeling, what we want to accomplish together, and what we're going to accomplish individually, and then we kind of go our separate ways. That's the first part of my daily ritual that is so incredibly important to me. And then the next piece I would tell you is I always start every day with some sort of gratitude, whether that is with my children or whether that is with reaching out to other people in my community that I'm connected with, or even just sending some sort of note out to a client that I'm currently working with that expresses a gratitude. For me, those two things set my mindset and my frame of mind in a very positive direction for what the day has to come. Anything that comes at me, I'm already ready to achieve exactly what I want to, which is, again, give people the ability to do more. So, yeah, it's great. So those are the two things the rituals that start my day. There's probably a few more we could get into, but again, I think those are ones that anybody could do and feel really great about themselves and the work they're doing.
Absolutely. No, I think it's great. I think it's super. And they are things that you can make into such an integral part and build into your day, every day on a daily basis without, too much challenge other than actually sticking to it, which is the challenge. But I think that is fantastic. So I know that you wanted to share something with the audience, and also you might tell people how they can get in touch with you, Devin, because I'm sure they would love to do that.
Absolutely. So before I talk about how we can get in touch, I want to talk about something that all of you listening have the opportunity to do. I would love to send you an autographed copy of my book, Belonging Factor. So I'm going to give away 2 autographed copies to everybody here who's listening to the podcast. And the way to enter to win is to just go to the website winning.belongingfactor.com. That's winning.belongingfactor.com. Be able to put in your email address and name there. And 10 days from the air date here, we will select our winners. So make sure you get in there today and check it out and register for your copy. And then, of course, you can always get in touch with me. Belongingfactor.com has a absolute easy way to get in touch with me, but I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn and learn more about your story and your journey as well. So you can find me just Devin Halliday on LinkedIn, Chief Belonging Architect at Rudiment Solutions.
That is fantastic. Devin, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you for that offer of the gift. That we will have all of that in the show notes so that people can actually go and find it. But I really want to thank you. I know that I've gone over the time that I said it would take, but that's because the quality of your answers and responses were just so brilliant. So thank you so much for coming along. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed having you, and I wish you well.
John, thanks so much.